Mr. Poilievre encouraged people to buy Bitcoin, which is a digital currency. So I'm quite surprised that he is saying now that he would ban digital currency, as if he does not know that Bitcoin is a digital currency. He also encouraged people to cash in their fiat currency, their paper money, and buy Bitcoin. If they had done that, they would have lost $37,000 by the time he had said that, to do that to today. So I'm very concerned about that.
Mr. Poilievre.
Well, that's just false. One, Bitcoin is not a central bank digital currency. It is obviously not. It's not controlled by any central bank anywhere in the world. Two, people can make their own investment decisions. I've simply said they should be free to decide whether or not they want to use Bitcoin. I don't want to be like communist China and ban Bitcoin or other technologies, because in a free market, people should have the opportunity to make those decisions for themselves. That's my position.
Thank you very much.
CPI does not properly capture the real rise in the cost of things. And do I believe that the government is deliberately understating inflation? Absolutely, because it allows them to justify the continued printing of money to fund irresponsible government spending.
But I would point out, immediately after the Second World War, we immediately started paying down our debt. We had the biggest surplus in Canadian history in 1947, 5% of GDP, which would be $120 billion surplus in today's terms, something not even imaginable. And so how are we paying for all of this? Well, I had my staff dig deep into the sources of funds. And for the first time, maybe ever in Canadian history, the number one source of funds was not tax revenue. It wasn't even borrowing. It was the central bank. We collected $293 billion worth of taxes as a government, and got about $303 billion from the Bank of Canada. So in other words, the biggest single source of funding the government's operations in the last fiscal year was the central bank.
Money, of course, is merely a technology by which we transport value over time and space. And without it, our species would have to consume in the present everything that it produces. Most species do. They have to eat what they kill right away, lest it be stolen or spoiled. Sure, squirrels can squirrel away a little bit, a good habit the government should learn from, but most species have to use it or lose it. We developed a technology that would allow two people who are exchanging things to go ahead with their exchange, even if each did not have the ability to supply the other with something that the other wanted. They could simply use this technology called money in order to transport the value between each other across time and around different geographies. And so over time, money has taken many forms. In one South Pacific island, it was just a ledger carved on scarce limestone. In some places, it's been beads or seashells. In prisons, they use cigarettes. In school, they used to use candy when I was a kid. Throughout history, it became metal, some precious, some brute. We had gold, we had silver, we had copper. Many different means of translating value across space and time have been used. But politicians have found it a nuisance to pay their bills using money with integrity, because back in 1215, poor old King John was forced by the barons and the commoners to sign this nuisance of a document called the Magna Carta, the Great Charter. And in that document was inscribed the principle that the Crown could not tax what the people had not approved. And that principle is still in place here in this Parliament today. Government can't spend what we don't vote on 800 years later. And you look around and see the beautiful green here. You know where that comes from, of course. It's because that was the color of the fields in which King John was made low. And that green should remind everyone that the people in the fields who are actually doing the work, they're the ones that produce the money that we spend around here. That might have been a better answer in the committee than a government's broader macroeconomic framework, Mr. Speaker. But I digress. Throughout time, other politicians have found other creative ways. The dictator Dionysius, who was a Greek dictator in Syracuse, he actually took all the coins, the 1 drachma coins, and he stamped them with a 2. So all of a sudden he had twice as much money. Now I hesitate to tell that story in this House because I worry that this Prime Minister might think that he could do the same. You know, if you run out of money, if you run out of money, he'll say, you can always get more. You'll turn loonies to toonies and toonies to fours. That might be the next creative idea by which government could get its hands on money.
Following his advice that we saw on YouTube, would have lost 20% of their earnings. Do you actually think your parents enjoy having your parents lose 20% of their retirement funds? I mean, this is lunacy, and it doesn't make sense at all.
Mr. Brown.
I have to agree with Dr. Lewis and Mr. Charest. I disagree with Mr. Poilievre's approach that you can opt out of inflation with cryptocurrency. Magic internet money fluctuates vastly, 30% or more in one day. And the last thing we should be doing is encouraging our parents and grandparents, along with vulnerable families, to gamble their savings, their retirements in something this risky that's been learned watching late-night YouTube videos.
Mr. Poilievre.
Well, Mr. Brown, that's not what I said. You're misleading the public. I clearly stated that people should have the freedom. Now, the reason why many people have chosen to exercise that freedom is because central banks have been attacking the value of our national currencies by printing $400 billion here in Canada, leading to 30-year highs in inflation, doubling the house prices, leading to massive volatility in many sectors of our economy. And that risk is one I pointed out earlier on and could lead to another debt crisis. So frankly, we should protect the value of our traditional money rather than banning private money.
Pierre Poilievre says the bank is financially illiterate. It's been so bad.
Well, that's bullshit. To be blunt.
That's blunt. Really?
Yeah, absolutely. The bank understands.
You're insulted by that.
Yes, I'm very insulted by that.
And why? Why?
Why? Because they understand what's going on. They made a judgment call,
right,
which I think was 100% right.
Right. What do you make about take back our money supply and opting out of inflation?
Well, I have no idea what he's talking about, and neither does he in that regard. On the crypto issue, he's just wrong. He's just wrong because the issue of rising prices that you have to cope with out of your income is fundamentally at the moment a structural one. Right. That we have limitations on supply, right, in part because of a war, in part because of COVID, in part because of ongoing features of the economy of we're all getting older, right, and the labor force is not growing as fast.
So in other words, the biggest single source of funding the government's operations in the last fiscal year was the central bank. Now this year, the numbers are even more interesting. So on a Monday, about a month ago, the finance minister announced a deficit that equaled $3 billion a week. Well, 2 days later, on a Wednesday, the governor of the Bank of Canada announced he would be buying government debt at the rate of, you guessed it, $3 billion a week. So the bank is basically going to print the entire deficit for this fiscal year. So we're living in a magical wonderland where nothing costs money, and we just simply turn on the printers and let the cash come pouring in.
Thank you very much. I guess with all the money printing deficits, they didn't have enough paper left to print these documents, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Minister of Inflation for her presentation today. It reveals that inflation is in fact 50% higher than she promised in the budget.
Wow.
And the deflation that she said we'd have a year ago has definitely not materialized. $500 billion of inflationary deficits mean more dollars chasing fewer goods and higher prices. The result, of course, is that housing and gas is up by 1/3, making it hard for people to get to work or house themselves. Food prices will rise $1,000 for the average family next year. And not to mention that taxes cost the average family more than food, clothing, and shelter combined. The more this government spends, the more Canadians pay. And to add insult to injury, we learned today that the government is collecting a windfall of tax revenue as they get higher taxes on higher prices. It's called the inflation tax, or as liberals would say, JustInflation. So my question is a very specific one. How much in extra tax revenue will the government collect as a result of higher than expected inflation on the backs of Canadian consumers?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister.
Mr. Speaker, that question actually was a very general and meandering one. So I'm going to offer a general and specific answer. And let me say this. Yes, the government did undertake extraordinary spending.
Second, I'm sorry to interrupt. Please continue, Madam Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. So let me be very clear. Yes, the government did undertake extraordinary spending to support Canadians during the fight against COVID-19. And Mr. Speaker, in this fiscal update, we are making provision for further spending in that fight. We are spending on therapeutics. We are spending on rapid tests. We are spending on boosters. And we are making a $4.5 billion provision to account for potential additional costs imposed by Omicron. Mr. Speaker, I am absolutely confident that the vast majority of Canadians understand that this spending is not only necessary, it is essential to protect health and also to protect our economy.
Throughout the 20th century, we saw this same tactic of cash creation. In, of course, with the most famous example was in the early 1920s in Germany. They had created so many new units of account that inflation ran rapid out of control. You needed to have a wheelbarrow full of cash in order to buy a loaf of bread. And if you got to the bar to try and drink away your inflationary blues, you ordered all your beer at the beginning of the night because as the minutes went on, it became more expensive. And of course, we in this part of the world have not been immune to this inflationary disease ourselves. While in the post-war era, we inherited monstrous debts fighting the fascists, but governments had hard money from the end of the war until the early 70s. We basically operated on an American-led standard whereby you could, if you had a U.S. greenback, you could exchange it at a rate of $35 per ounce of gold. And in that period, of course, we had an enormous amount of prosperity. The Americans paid off their war debts. Here in Canada, with solid currency, we wrestled the inflationary beast to the ground in the post-war era. We took our record debts that we inherited from the war, we paid them off, we increased the size of the Canadian economy by 300%. And by 1933, we had basically become a debt. In 1973, we had basically become a debt-free country.
There are governments that want to spend in an undisciplined way use inflation as their tool. They print cash and they pass the bill on to consumers through inflation. It's the inflation tax. We have to end it, restore hard, sound money and low inflation by getting government spending under control and stopping the central bank from printing it.
You can Google it yourself and watch it on the internet, and I have to say, it is bad advice to be giving to Canadians that is so risky, and you should know that. As a former finance critic, that's not the advice you should be giving to the country.
And Mr. Poilievre, you raised your your paddle for one more time?
Mr. Brown, if you want to talk about risks to people's finances, you were the one who said, you promised when you ran for the leadership of the Progressive Conservative Party of Ontario, you would oppose a carbon tax. And then as soon as you got in, you reversed yourself entirely. Not only did you endorse just any carbon tax, you endorsed the carbon tax of Justin Trudeau, which is in place today and recently increased and is one of the reasons why prices are so high across this country. That is a threat to our money. That is a decision you made after you promised not to. People can't believe a word you said.
But then what happened in the 1970s? Well, President Nixon wanted to spend on warfare and welfare. Of course, the Americans were bogged down in Vietnam, which was costly an enterprise, and President Nixon wanted to keep his popularity at home, so he decided to spend. And in the decade that followed 1971, not only did they unleash the American dollar from any particular standard, but they increased the number of US dollars in circulation by 150%, while output only grew by about 39%. In other words, the amount of money grew about 4 times faster than the amount of underlying output that money represented. Now, here in Canada, we had Pierre Trudeau, and he looked down at all the inflation that the US government was creating. They had reached double-digit inflation down there, a total inflationary crisis. The American dollar was devalued on an international basis and, of course, was incapable of buying affordable petroleum on the world market. They liked to blame OPEC, but they took no responsibility for the fact that the unit with which they were buying oil on the international markets was itself devalued. So Trudeau says, he looks down at all the misery in the United States. He looked at how people were lined up at gas stations trying to wait for an hour and a half in order to gas up their cars. He saw the poverty that was overtaking inner city streets. He saw the expanding wealth gap in the United States of America. And what did Pierre Trudeau say to all that? He said, let's have some of that up here. And so he started printing some money here in Canada and massively increased the money supply with which Canada, I just have the data right here. Between 1971 and 1981, the money supply in Canada grew by over 200%, while GDP only grew in real terms by about 47%. So you can imagine, money is growing in supply at more than 4 times the rate as the economy is growing. So you have more dollars chasing fewer goods, and what do you get? Inflation. That's right.
Central banks are ruining fiat currencies by printing money. They're printing cash to fund irresponsible government deficits. That is driving up inflation and causing people all over the world to look for alternatives to government-run currency. And so, as you've seen, there's been a proliferation of all kinds of digital, they're not just digital currencies, but digital assets like Bitcoin. And I think that this is overall a positive development. It's giving people an opportunity to protect themselves against government-induced inflation and hopefully providing some healthy competition to the government monopoly on our cash.
It is, of course, it's a massive wealth transfer from the working poor to the super rich. Of course, the rich have no problem with inflation because it inflates their asset values. The rich don't deal in cash. They have a small checking account that allows them the liquidity to get through their day-to-day frappuccino drinking, but they principally hold their wealth in assets that go up in price as the money supply grows. So their real estate explodes, their financial assets, bonds, stocks, or other instruments become more valuable. But the working poor, who only have their wages and the money that they can bear to stash into the bank, that all becomes less valuable. So effectively, it is the inflation tax, which hurts the poor, helps the rich, and allows the government to spend money it doesn't have. And you mentioned 1980. Well, we know that what happened in the aftermath of 1980, it was stagflation. And we had both high unemployment and high inflation. Unemployment was at 12%. Inflation was at 12%. Add the two together, you get the misery index of 24%, the highest in Canadian history. And we saw 650,000 people fall below the poverty line. And the highest suicide rate in Canadian history, 14.8 suicides per 100,000 people, by far the highest suicide rate. When the misery index gets high enough, people end their misery. It sounds, like a small thing. Oh, you're paying more for things. But when people can't pay their mortgages because inflation has driven up interest rates over 20%, or they can't afford to buy groceries, and simultaneously their wages have dropped because the job market is in chaos, well, they become absolutely desperate, and desperate times call for desperate and sometimes tragic measures. So that means that great human tragedy can unfold with these policies. So that, and not because of some numbers on a spreadsheet, is why we should care about this.
And I think that's a very positive thing. Now, China recently banned Bitcoin, which has turned out to be a good thing, because it means that the mining is moving out of China and into, frankly, more environmentally friendly countries, where we have cleaner energy sources to do the mining necessary to calculate new Bitcoins into existence. And that gives countries like Canada an opportunity to take more of a leadership role. So I think there's a lot of positive developments in this space. There's many opportunities. I think Ontario, for example, Shams, needs to look at how it can use, perhaps potentially reduce the damage of the Green Energy Act. The previous Liberal government brought in this ridiculous law that caused for huge subsidies of wind and solar power that is so intermittent that often we get power surges from them that we have to pay other American states to take off of our grid. So right now we have too much electricity. We pay the northern U.S. competitors to take our energy, and we have to explore the possibility that energy could instead be purchased by Bitcoin mines. That would be better than paying American states to take it. And it would allow us, and it'd be clean, green, emissions-free Bitcoin mining that would generate opportunity for us here in Canada. So I think all of this is very exciting, very positive. Be ready, though, because as these alternative assets start to gain steam and governments feel they're under threat to their monopoly, they will look for every excuse in the book to try and ban it, regulate it, get in the way, just as the Chinese government has already done.